So we're carrying on in Exodus this morning from where James has been taking us. And we come to this part in chapter 17. So just to set the context, historians reckon at this point the Israelites are probably about 6 weeks out of slavery. So as part of their overall 40 years in the wilderness, they're still pretty early on in their journey. And so far, we've seen them already grumble about food and already struggle about water. So to be honest, they're not doing too well. And we get to this story, and there are 3 key things that I want to draw out. There are 3 sort of phases we see that the Israelites go through in chapter 17. So the first one, who here loves camping? Hands up. Great. I love it when I see like families split, like you see like the husband put his hand up and the wife's hand down, and you think they have a lot of fun. Emily and I, we got given some money when we first got married, and one of the things we wanted to do was go and buy a tent. We didn't do a lot of talking before turning up to the camp shop, but I think we both had different visions about the sort of tent we were going to be buying. I imagined one of these tiny, small tents that we would take on the Scottish Highlands, and we would fit, the one that says like it's a 3-man tent, but really it's half a man in the bag. That was my vision, adventure, camping. I think what Emily had in mind, I wouldn't call camping, I would call a palace. She wanted a tent, and it quickly unfolded that actually her definition of a tent was something you could stand up in. Oh, there you go. And I'll be honest, actually, I do think I probably enjoy camping a little bit more now. We have a nice airbed, she puts the fairy lights out, and she puts the rugs out. And so what we see is kind of this camping going on, and that's what happens with the Israelites. They're camping throughout their time in the wilderness. And the point of like camping, and I don't know what you found when you're camping, but anyone that's told me they've never had an argument with their other half or with their friends as they're camping is probably lying, because everyone has an argument almost as soon as they arrive at the campsite. And that is about, where do you pitch the tent? Exactly, yes. It's where you pitch the tent. Do you pitch it facing north? Do you pitch it facing south? Where's the sun? Oh, you've got your noisy neighbours. So many factors to consider. Where do you pitch your tent? And that's the problem. And what we see here, this is the first part, the first phase of what the Israelites are after. And we see chaos in the camp. The Israelites have come and they've set up their tent. They're 6 weeks in on their journey. And we see them start to moan. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. In fact, we see later on, all they could see were rocks around them. And so where they'd chosen to pitch their tent, there was no water, there was no provision. And I think we all know that actually where you want to pitch your tent is probably close-ish to the toilet blocks, for example, but not too far away, close-ish to the water. And I think the question we have as we see this chaos in the camp, and the question that comes for us is, what is it you see when you stop and pause? When you set up camp, when you create your home, your safe space? So often that says so much about where your heart is at. What is it you see is around you when you stop and pause? Because the Israelites, they'd seen God provide, they'd seen him open the Red Sea, they'd seen him part rivers, they've already seen him provide water, they've already seen him provide food. And yet when they camp and stop again, they're struck and they're stuck in their old mindset of being, oh, it was much better in slavery where we were stuck, we had food, we had water. But the question they have is, all we can see around us is rocks. God, are you going to provide? And so that's the question, I think, for you, is, first of all, do you stop? Do you stop and camp? Because so often it's in those times where you feel God speak to you, where you feel him share with you, where you feel him say things. And then it's when you stop, what is it you see? Because all the Israelites saw were rocks. They didn't see the God that provided, that sat behind the rocks. They didn't see the God that could open the rocks and bring water out for them. One thing, though, that I think one thing that I love about the Israelites, and this is like a little bit of a side point for you, but it's when they have a crisis, they so often look to someone, and that person is Moses. And that's not that we shouldn't look to Jesus, but actually the question is when you stop and when you start to have your crisis in your camp, where you have your crisis in your home, where you have your crisis, who is it you look to for your answers? And the Israelites often get it right because they go to Moses, who they know is trusted, who they know loves the Lord. And I think there's something in that for us about when we don't know what to do, who are the leaders we go to? Who are the godly people that are around you that are feeding into your life? They looked to Moses, and Moses went to the Lord. And so there's something in that for us, that when we have that crisis in a camp, we might be, and we so often, as I said, see it in that safe space, see it when we're at home, or we see it when we're on holiday and when we choose to stop. And that's the time where we hear, where we realise maybe how far we've gone from the Lord, how things have changed, how different we are. But it's in those times where we need to say, actually, yes, I'm going to look to Jesus, but who are the people around me I'm going to look to as well? Where's the input coming from? Who's going to provide the wisdom? And so that's the first phase we see for the Israelites, is we see the crisis in the camp, and we see them choose to look at Moses when that happens. But we remember as well how easily they forgot what God has done. And so when we come to that crisis in the camp, it's so important we remember, where has God led us to before? Where have we seen God's provision time and time again? So that we know and we have those things to look back to that give us faith for the future. So that's the first phase. The second phase, the second thing that I want to bring out, and I'm going to start by reading one of my favourite quotes from a film. It's from The Lord of the Rings. For those of you that know me will know that I love Lord of the Rings. The second one in particular is a highlight. And we get this, it's always worrying when people laugh when you don't actually make a joke. So here we go. So I think this quote's actually, it might be from the first film, and it's a quote from a guy called Sam. So the context is Sam and Frodo are on an adventure to destroy this ring and save the world. And this is what he says to Frodo, his friend. He said, "It's like the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad has happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing. This shadow, even darkness, must pass. A new day will come when the sun shines. It will shine out the clearer. I know now folks in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, but they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something. And they kept going because they are holding on to something." And the second thing I think we learn from this, the second sort of phase or part of this story, is we see that the Israelites' trust is tested. So we've had the chaos in the camp, and then we see their trust is tested. And for me, there's two questions that I see in the crux of this passage, and I think there's two questions that we always should ask when we go through crisis, with what's going on around us. And the first question I think everyone should ask, whether you're a Christian or not, is, God, are you there? And then second of all, God, are you good? We see at the very end of the chapter, they say, is the Lord among us or not? Because the reality is whatever crisis you're going through, whatever it is you're going through, if the Lord's there and if the Lord is good, then it doesn't matter. Because we don't need to worry, because he's there and he's good. And so that's what I think we need to remember when we have these tough times, when there isn't the water there, when all we can see is the rocks. We need to remember, yes, the Lord is there, and yes, he is good. And they're the two promises you can always stand on, no matter what you see, no matter what happens. The Lord is there, and the Lord is good. In fact, I think if you look throughout the whole Bible, What it really is stories and stories of the Lord going, and the Lord whispering to his people, do you trust me? Do you trust me? Think right from like Abraham taking his son up a mountain, the Lord going, do you trust me? Daniel going into the lion's den, do you trust me? There's hundreds of stories. Esther going before the king, do you trust me? And that's what we see time and time again. And that was a quote from the Lord of the Rings at the start. You know, the good stories, the things that will make a difference, and the people that we see that in like films throughout, and we see it as well through the heroes of our faith, is actually the people that we hear about, the people that make their stories. They're the ones that their trust is tested, but they choose to trust whatever happens. They choose to trust in those two really important facts. The Lord is here and the Lord is good. I loved it when we sung that song about Waymaker. And it says, even when we don't see it, you're working. Even when we don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop. And that's what I want to say here is the Israelites couldn't see it. They couldn't see the rocks, and they chose to go and moan. They chose to go and complain. They could see the rocks, but they couldn't see the water. They couldn't see the Lord that sat behind the rocks that wanted to provide for them. And that's what we always need to be looking for in the times of chaos, in the times of crisis. What is it that sat behind the problem? In fact, one of the best things I think you can ask if you're in a time of crisis, and so often we want to say, God, come and fix this. God, come and heal me. But perhaps you could try praying something different wherever you're at. And that is, God, where are you in this? Where's your presence in this? What are you working on in this? What is it you're changing in this? How can I see you at work here? Yes, of course, we contend for healing. Yes, we contend for things to get better. But also there's something about just recognizing and trusting whatever happens in that. Could you put the passage up from Numbers, Ayo? Thank you. Just to show how seriously God took the Israelites' choice to trust him or not. This is what he said. This is towards the end of their time in the wilderness. Not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one has treated me with contempt will ever see it. God takes our choice to trust him really importantly. He takes it very seriously. So much so that actually, and we don't have too much time to go into this, but we see a passage in Numbers later on where Moses has exactly the same scenario going on. There's a rock there before him. And God says, this time I don't want you to hit the rock with your staff. What I want you to do is I want you to speak to the rock. God always wants to do something different in circumstances because he wants to know, do you trust me? Do you trust what I'm doing? Not what you've seen before, not what you know you can do. Do you trust what I'm doing? And what happens there is that's actually the point at which God then turns around and says to Moses, you can't come into the promised land anymore. You're still stuck in that mindset of not trusting me fully. Because what Moses does is rather than speaking to the rock, he goes back to what he's seen happening. He hits the rock with his staff. And I always imagine it, he's like, it's about me. It's about kind of what I can do, rather than being like, okay, God, I trust you in this. I'm going to do what you say. He knew he could trust God, but in that moment, he got it wrong. And that's how important it is that we choose to trust God. We choose to trust him with our decisions. Maybe we need to trust him with our finances. Maybe there's something we need to trust him with our work, with our family. Because actually, like Moses, we've kind of taken it upon ourselves and we're doing something we've seen God do before. Or maybe not. Maybe we're just trusting fully on ourselves and God's saying, trust me, speak to the rock this time instead of hit the rock. And I think where we often can get a bit confused in our trusting is actually we sometimes see, like what we've seen here is God's taken the Israelites out of slavery, but he's actually got something even better for them. He's not actually just taken them into a wilderness. He's given them a promised land, and it's theirs. He's promised it for them. And I wonder how many of us have seen partial promises of God in our lives completed. actually, you know what, I'm going to heal you. But actually what we do is we still know that we have pain sometimes. Or actually, God's given you a vision and you've started to implement it and you think that's it. But actually what God says is there's actually a full promised land for you. And at the moment, some of you are stuck a little bit in the wilderness. He's taken you from the place of slavery. He's taken you from the really bad stuff. But actually, he's not yet revealed and you've not yet chosen to walk into the fullness. So that's the second one. So we've seen the chaos in the camp and the fact that the Israelites needed to see the water, not the rock. And then we've seen their trust under test, choosing to trust God in that circumstance and trust that God is at work. And here's the third one. I want you to picture a scenario. Imagine if you're watching your favourite film. I'm trying to think of a good example, but I think a good one is like The Great Escape. It's one of I love it. I love the war films. And imagine if in the tunnel, they've dug the tunnel and then the film ends. That would be disappointing, right? Put it another way. Imagine if you're watching your favourite football team. Maybe, Bob, you're watching Chelsea play. And what happens at the end is, the 85th minute, 1-1. The TV stops, and then you never know what happens. 1-1. Disaster. I don't know, think about this. But what we see in this passage is actually interesting, and I'd never seen it before. But I don't want to say whoever wrote Exodus got it wrong, but they missed a really important thing. So as we come to the end, it says, I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Anyone see anything missing in that? Yeah, did the water come out? We're never actually told in this passage if the water came out or not. We read elsewhere in Scripture that the water came out of the rock, so we know it did, and I think I'm not doubting that. But I think there's something interesting on this, which is we never know specifically in this passage if the water came out of the rock. And so I was trying to think about why, and I think the key is this. And because how Moses decided to name that place, is the Lord among us or not? And what the Lord said is, in verse 6, I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. It was never about the water. The question was, the prize for the Israelites was always his presence. And that's the third point. That's the third thing we see for the Israelites. His presence is always our prize. It's never the healing. It's never the financial breakthrough. It's always about his presence. One of my favourite songs at the moment, I just get a bit obsessive sometimes with songs, and I just play them over and over and over again. And it's a song by Maverick City, and this is how it goes. It's called He's in the Room, and it goes, I've got a treasure here in my heart, and in my weakness it won't depart. I have a Saviour who will abide. He's not just with me, he lives inside. Go ask Daniel if our God will bring you out, and he will testify. He shut the lion's mouth. Go ask those Hebrew boys if he'll stick by your side. They will identify fourth man in the fire. Daniel went into the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego went into the fire. Abraham went up the mountain. The Israelites left the wilderness, left the slavery into a place of wilderness. And it was never that in those places that God led them to, that it was easy. It was never that was exactly what they wanted or what they hoped for. But the promise always was that God was going to be with them in those situations. And so in your crisis, in whatever's going on, maybe even in the good times, we need to remember his presence is always the prize. You're not alone, and he is good. His presence is always the prize that we need to look for. The story reminds, I think, is very much of Jesus with the woman at the well. Io, can you flash up the scripture, please, just to remind us? So a Samaritan woman came to water, and Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" The Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock? Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water, welling up for eternal life." And something as I was reflecting on this passage that I felt like really came home to me and came true to me was that I love the Old Testament stories. I love God appearing to the Israelites as a nation. I love the story of God taking Daniel out of the lion's den and saving him, or Jesus being in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's so many of them I love. And I kind of was thinking about this, and I realized actually, I think one of the reasons sometimes we enjoy the Old Testament is because actually we don't have to relate to the fact that actually when we see what we see in the New Testament is the presence of Jesus actually comes as a person, and that's a bit more vulnerable for us. And what we have to do is we have to choose to reflect into Jesus as a person. The fact that Jesus as a person says to you, "I love you, I care for you, I'm here with you." And so we can get really excited by the big, powerful God of the Old Testament sometimes. But there's a reality that as we look at what his presence really means, is it means sometimes in the New Testament world, us being a bit more vulnerable and saying, actually, I need you, Jesus. I need your presence here with me. I need to know you by my side. And that's a lot more vulnerable. That's a lot more tricky. So where have we gone from? We've seen the crisis in the camp. We've seen the Israelites starting to moan, starting to struggle. But we know that what they needed to do was not look at the rocks, but realize there was a God that sat behind the rocks that could bring water out of them. We saw their trust tested, and we see it tested time and time again. But we know that God was always at work. And the third point is, we see that his presence is always a prize. It was never about the water. The water alone was never going to save the Israelites in Israel. It might have kept them going for that day or the next day. But actually what we always need is his presence. And that's not a flippant comment. That's a genuine fact that we need his presence. It might not feel like it sometimes. That's the thing that will keep us going time and time again when we're in difficult situations, when we're in good times. It's his presence that keeps us going. It was never about the living water.